It wasn't a trade dispute. It wasn't a supply chain error. It wasn't even a diplomatic standoff. It was the structural seizure of the physical foundations of the global economy. The pattern is unmistakable. History shows that when a hegemon financializes its economy, it outsources the dirty work of extraction and refining to the periphery. It assumes that paper currency will always command physical resources. It assumes that the mine and the smelter will always obey the bank. But eventually, the periphery realizes they hold the leverage. The producer stops accepting the paper. The supply chains harden into weapons, and the empire finds itself with ample liquidity, but no access to the critical materials required to maintain its standard of living. The arithmetic is merciless. We can trace this exact sequence through 3 specific historical turning points. It begins in the ancient world, the Roman Empire. 1st century AD, under Nero, the silver content of the denarius was roughly 98%. It was the standard of the world. Merchants from India to Britannia accepted it without question. But the costs of empire were compounding. The legions required constant payment. The bureaucracy was swelling. The grain dole for the citizens of Rome was becoming unsustainable. Instead of fiscal discipline, the state chose the shortcut. They began to debase the currency. They mixed copper into the silver melt. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, the silver content had collapsed to less than 5%. Think about what that means. The physical silver was gone, flowed out to the east to pay for silk and spices, or hoarded by those who saw the writing on the wall. The state was left with washed copper coins that the soldiers eventually refused to accept. A legionnaire into 70 AD didn't care about the face on the coin. He cared that it could no longer buy a loaf of bread. The complex trade networks of the Mediterranean disintegrated because the trust in the medium of exchange had evaporated. Rome still had the legions. Rome still had the laws. But Rome had lost the silver. And without the silver, the center could not hold. Just like Rome. The Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries fell into the trap of resource illusion. Spain controlled the greatest silver discovery in human history, Cerro Rico, the rich mountain of Potosi in present-day Bolivia. The silver flowed in rivers across the Atlantic. It seemed like infinite wealth, but Spain did not use this wealth to build domestic industry. They did not build smelters or manufactories. They used the silver to buy finished goods from the Dutch, the English, and the French. They outsourced the productivity while retaining the consumption. The result was the price revolution. Inflation tore through the Spanish economy. A shoemaker in Castile could no longer afford the leather to make shoes because the influx of silver had bid up the price of commodities, while the domestic production base had atrophied. The crown defaulted on its debts repeatedly in 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. They owned the mines, they owned the galleons, but they did not control the economic mechanism. The silver flowed right through Spain, leaving behind nothing but inflation and a hollowed-out empire that could no longer feed itself. Just like Spain, the British Empire entered the 20th century with a fatal assumption about its place in the world. By 1914, London was the banker to the globe. The sterling was as good as gold. But to world wars and the rise of the welfare state drained the treasury. Britain had shifted from the world's factory to the world's financier. They relied on imports for food, for energy, and for raw materials. When the Suez Crisis hit in 1956, the reality was laid bare. The United States threatened to sell off sterling bonds, collapsing the currency. If Britain didn't back down, Britain had no choice. They lost the ability to project power because they had lost their financial sovereignty. By the 1970s, the once mighty pound was being devalued, and the IMF had to step in. The British worker in the Midlands, facing the 3-day week and soaring electricity costs, learned a hard lesson. Financial dominance is temporary. Resource constraints are permanent. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is the era of sound money and industrial dominance, where the nation produces more than it consumes. Stage 2 is the expansion of social commitments and military reach, funded by the initial surplus. Stage 3 is the pivot to financialization, where the nation begins to import goods and export debt. Stage 4 is the critical turning point, the outsourcing of the industrial base and the refining capacity to cheaper jurisdictions. Stage 5 is the onset of resource nationalism, where the producer nations begin to restrict supply or demand payment in real assets rather than debt. Stage 6 is the currency crisis, triggered by the loss of access to critical inputs. Stage 7 is the flight to hard assets and the revaluation of real things against paper promises. Just like the British Empire in the 1970s, the United States today stands at the precipice of a resource shock, but with a specific, modern twist involving silver. Current data suggest China now controls between 60 and 70% of global silver refining and processing capacity. While the raw ore is mined in Mexico, Peru, or Poland, the complex metallurgy required to turn that ore into industrial-grade silver often runs through Chinese smelters. This creates a choke point. Silver is not just a monetary metal anymore. It is the most conductive element on the periodic table. It is the lifeblood of the digital and green economy. Solar panels, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and military guidance systems all require massive amounts of silver. The United States has committed to a green energy transition that is mathematically impossible without secure access to this metal. Yet, recent trade restrictions on metals like gallium and germanium show that the incentive structure has changed. The producer is no longer willing to exchange finite strategic resources for depreciating treasury bonds without friction if the refining capacity is weaponized or if export quotas are lowered. To satisfy China's own internal industrial demand, the West faces a supply cliff. The price of silver is currently set in paper markets in London and New York, but the physical control sits in Shanghai and Shenzhen. When physical scarcity meets paper leverage, the result is a violent repricing. Some economic historians note that technology always finds a way, arguing that substitution will solve the shortage. They point to thrifting, where manufacturers use less silver per unit. But this argument fails to account for the Jevons paradox. As efficiency increases, total consumption often rises because the technology becomes cheaper and more ubiquitous. Furthermore, the physical properties of silver, its thermal and electrical conductivity, have no equal in the periodic table. You cannot substitute copper in high-end photovoltaics without losing significant efficiency. The incentive for the dominant refiner is to keep the metal for their own high-value manufacturing, selling the finished solar panel rather than the raw silver. Under these constraints, the rational move for the controlling power is to squeeze the downstream consumer. The end game approaches in one of three ways. First is controlled decline. In this scenario, the consuming nations accept a lower standard of living. Prices for electronics, energy, and goods rise permanently. Rationing of strategic materials becomes policy. We saw this in the US during World War II with copper and steel, anchored by the War Production Board in 1942. The second possibility is chaotic collapse. This occurs when the paper price of the commodity disconnects entirely from the physical price. Exchanges fail to deliver. Industrial users panic buy, creating a feedback loop of hoarding. This mirrors the collapse of the London gold pool in 1968, where the artificial price suppression broke under the weight of market reality. The third and final outcome is reset and restructure. Here, the currency is formally devalued to reflect the new cost of resources. Money is printed to subsidize the strategic industries, leading to a decade of high inflation but keeping the factories running. This is the path taken by France in the late 1950s before the introduction of the new franc in 1960. The only variable is timing and pain. Subscribe to this channel. Study the supply chains of the assets you rely on. Understand that in a resource-constrained world, possession is the only law that matters.